This is the amazing story of a royal armor workshop. The tale of how Henry VIII set great craftsmen the task of transforming him into a dazzling mythic hero, of how his daughter Elizabeth used their remarkable talents to help create a chivalric cult with herself at its head. If she'd been a man, this is what Elizabeth would have looked like. It's the story of a king, a queen, a culture, and the precise manipulation of one image. An image we all think we know very well. One of the most powerful images in history, the image of the knight. Armor was protection, but it was also high fashion. It was costume. It was theater. It gave the wearer an incredibly imposing presence, making him seem invincible, superhuman. Armor has always been there. It existed in nature long before we caught up. The name armadillo means, essentially, little armored guy. Ancient peoples understood that armor had symbolic power. From the ancient Greeks and Romans who wore beaten bronze into battle, to the Normans who conquered England in long coats of iron mail, to the knights of King Edward III, who won that staggering victory against the French at Crécy in 1346, wearing plates of hardened leather, horn, and iron. Armor had always had great artistic merit, but it became a kind of wearable sculpture with the development of full plate armor. Full armor appeared in the late 14th century, when it first became possible to smelt big enough pieces of iron and steel to make backplates, breastplates, and all the other 20 or so parts that make up the complete harness, as it was called. Full plate armor was an awesome sight. It was so powerful, in fact, that it came to define an age. When we think of the medieval past, we think of armored knights. In Britain, metal armor had been worn since the Bronze Age. Records of English armor makers date back to the early Middle Ages. But it's impossible to be sure of the origin of the few rare pieces that survive, like this helmet found in a field in Warwickshire. You just look at the way the visor follows the shape of the skull. You know, all the curves are matched up so beautifully, and all the plates fit so well together. Yeah, it's obviously had a long and somewhat rough life, but it's a high-quality piece.
This could well have seen action in the Wars of the Roses. It's found in the Midlands. It dates from the second half of the 15th century. We just don't know the origin of this. So little English armour survives from before 1500. If it is English, it's evidence of very high level of skill and artistry. The plasticity of the form technically is extremely hard to do. That's a shape that would be quite familiar to a modern-day Olympic cyclist, for example. But the evidence just isn't there. We just have to say it's possibly English because of its history, but we don't know.
But there is another way to know the medieval armor of the British Isles. It's found in old churches all over England, Wales, and Scotland. Here you find complete English armors, beautifully carved in alabaster. This is the effigy of Richard de Vere, 11th Earl of Oxford, a great English knight and one of the commanders at Agincourt. He carries the De Vere star on his breastplate and the collar of SS at his neck, which identifies him as a supporter of the royal house of Lancaster. The figure records perfectly what plate armor looked like. Sabatons to protect the feet, the greaves or lower leg defenses, the cuisses or upper leg defenses, the breastplate, the vambraces protecting the arms, the gauntlets, and the tall, pointed helmet. What we're presented with is an incredibly accurate depiction of armor dating from the early 15th century. You know, you can take one of these effigies and build a working armor using it as a reference. I've done it, it works. This armor would work. You look very closely and you can see how Carver has placed every rivet in exactly the right place. The rivets in their locations are crucial because they determine whether the piece works or not. Here you've got the pivot point. The neck plate opens to allow the head to be inserted and then closes and locks around the neck. This is a realistic image of a real fighting knight. It's hard to avoid a sense that this is a figure that could just get right up and walk off. He could get up and attack the enemies of England or of Christendom. Effigies show us that very fine armor was being made in England long before the 16th century. But despite that, one man decided to make a conscious break with the English armor tradition and bring a new Renaissance style to the British Isles. That man was one of the greatest jousters, the greatest swordsmen, the greatest knights of his time, King Henry VIII. From an early age, Henry was obsessed with knighthood, but his father, the anxious King Henry VII, wouldn't let him joust or fight anyone, even just for fun.
When he's a little boy of just 3, he's put on his pony and he rides it without anyone leading him. Yes. He knows that he has to be, in a sense, the emblem of the virility and the continuation of his family. So his sense of his own destiny, and I imagine his sense of his own self-dramatization, must have been very intense in these years. We know he's very sporty, we know he's very strong, he's physically very robust, he's very handsome. People call him the handsomest prince in Christendom. And he really is, you know, a prince in waiting. He's wanting to spread his wings. They won't let him joust, they'll only let him run at the quintain. And that's so frustrating for a young man. All of his heroes, all of his friends, everyone at the court is jousting within an inch of their lives. And Henry is kept back by these very, very dominant guardians.
Then, in 1509, Henry's father died. From the moment he came to the throne, King Henry VIII could do as he liked. And what he liked was jousting. The joust was about hitting your opponent as hard and as accurately as possible with a steel-tipped wooden lance. It's a game that demonstrates strength in body, but also in mind. I've been jousting for 20 years. Here, the armor is definitely not for show. In fact, mine has saved my life on more than one occasion. A perfect strike should shatter the lance, making the score pretty obvious to anyone. Here you see the young King Henry breaking his lance on his opponent's head in celebration of the birth of a son by his queen, Catherine of Aragon. This illustration shows us what Henry looked like in armor early in his reign. His clothing may be exceptionally rich, but actually his jousting armor is quite plain. One of the most famous rulers at that time was Maximilian, Holy Roman Emperor and overlord of the German lands. Maximilian was a chivalric celebrity, the self-styled White King, who constantly presented himself in art as a victorious knight, clad in resplendent armor of his own design. Henry idolized him. He allied himself with Maximilian on the battlefield, studied how he had created a heroic public image, and in every way just wanted to be like him. On armor of the Maximilian style, the surfaces are covered with dense fluting, making the steel ripple like cloth. Maximilian's armors used the very latest decorative techniques. Surfaces were often etched with acid and gilded with mercury, but frequently only in narrow bands, so that you never lose the brilliance of the pure, polished steel. And just 3 years into his reign, Henry received a spectacular gift armor from Maximilian. This strange helmet is the only piece of that gift armor known to survive. It may look bizarre, and perhaps even frivolous to modern eyes, but it's actually a mark of Maximilian's absolute respect for Henry.
This really is a caricature of a portrait of Maximilian. It has exactly his hooked nose. He hasn't shaved properly. His chin's covered with stubble. And the quality of etching is absolutely fantastic. If you have a look at the little dragons that are on these hinge brackets, they're absolutely wonderful.
Yeah, really lively. The helmet reflects the Renaissance obsession with verisimilitude, to recreate the very image of a living human being in cold, hard metal. The smoothness of the surfaces disguises the thousands of hammer blows required to form the features. Could there ever have been a clearer demonstration of an armorer's power? The power to transform a delicate human body into an invulnerable automaton of tempered steel. When this armor arrived at Henry's court in 1514, you only need to look at fragments to try and imagine how impressive and moving that must have been for him. And he's got these aspirations to be a great Renaissance monarch, and then he's presented with the very best of what is going on the continent. There must have been a little part of him somewhere that felt a bit small at that point.
Well, do you think that? Or do you think, hey, I've arrived. I'm really at the top table. You know,
Yeah,
I'm getting
yeah.
presents from the emperor. He's using his own caricature as an armour for me, which you'd think was an odd joke for one king to play on another, but it's a motif that absolutely runs centrally through the iconography of the tournament. People are making themselves out to look fools and then impressing with their prowess on the tournament field.
At the same time as he received his gift, Henry bought 2 other armors from Maximilian's court workshop. But these great works of art have been lost. Except in the Wallace collection, there are 3 fascinating fragments, part of a lost armor made in Maximilian's court workshop at Innsbruck at exactly the right time, in exactly the right style. You can always tell when an armor or a piece of an armor has great artistic qualities, when you can feel it trying to seduce you. You know, even though we're just dealing with a pair of legs and a helmet, that's not really much of an armor. Even so, just those 3 pieces sitting here, they're just vibrating with energy, and they're trying to tell you something. These perfectly articulated structures pulse with the Renaissance fascination with the mechanics of nature. But who could they have been made for? They're very big legs. They're very muscular, beautifully shaped. The calves of a skilled horseman, a great warrior, no doubt. The helmet, it's for someone with a big head. This is a big, muscular guy. You can see where we're going with this. I believe that these may be parts of one of Henry's lost armors. It's not just the shape and the size, it's also the decoration. There are pomegranates all over this armor. They're crawling on every part of the decoration. They're appearing and poking out of all of the scrolling foliage and twisting vines, covered in pomegranates. And we can't avoid the fact, of course, that the pomegranate was the personal device of Catherine of Aragon, Henry's queen. It's a device that Henry made a point of wearing at every possible opportunity early in his reign. Maybe these are parts of one of the armors he received in 1514. We can't prove it. We'll never be sure. But they could be.
Maximilian's gift armor had lit a fire in Henry's heart. He had to have his own royal armor workshop. There he could create his own high-technology armors and take his rightful place alongside the most sophisticated rulers of Europe. He needed something highly engineered, beautifully shaped, and exquisitely decorated. Flemish armorers were famous throughout Europe, so Henry brought Flemings to England to establish his court workshop. Within a year, his first armor was complete, a celebration of his devotion to his queen.
The statement this armour makes about dynastic marriages is so strong.
Yeah.
The heraldry, you know, the pomegranates, the portcullises, the sheaves of arrows, the roses. That's showing Henry as a continental monarch. He's marrying into the Spanish royal family, yet he's at one with the rest of them.
No English armor before had been so extensively decorated. Every inch of this magnificent equestrian armor was polished, engraved, and covered in a layer of brightest silver.
And what's so interesting about it, this is engraved decoration. It's not the new modern etching and gilding. This is hand engraved, and it's decorated overall with this engraving. £200.
Just for the decoration?
Just for the decoration.
That's a lot more in the armor.
Oh yeah, totally.
Yeah.
£200 is an outrageous sum just to decorate an armor.
You can't escape a sense, even at this early stage, that there's tremendous ambition here. He doesn't just want to equal his continental colleagues, he sort of wants to surpass them. But at this point, he doesn't really know how to do it.
Yeah,
he's
not
just
sure,
getting going.
I'm not sure he's trying to surpass them at this stage. I think he just wants to be at the same table.
But engraving was a bit primitive compared to Maximilian's revolutionary acid etching. What Henry needed now was something that could hold its own against the very best foreign armors, but which was also totally unique. What if he could attract the best armor-making talent from different parts of Europe and put it all into one place, forming a crucible of creativity? Now he recruited armorers from the German Empire to join his Flemings. This elite team would soon be working hammer and tongs to keep up with the king's demands for the very best armor. This is Greenwich. Today it lies in the shadow of London's Canary Wharf. But in the 16th century, it was the location of one of Henry's favorite royal palaces. And most importantly for us, this was where Henry chose to build his royal workshop.
It's very, very different to what's down there now. None of these 18th century buildings would have been here in Henry's lifetime. All we would have seen moving down this walkway would be the great red brick structure of Henry's Palace of Placentia, quite literally his pleasure palace. So, that's where the royal workshops were. There's just a bunch of trees there now. And looking at the site now, we get a much better sense actually of the distance between the royal workshops and the palace itself. It's close enough for the king to just stroll over and meet with his armorers if he wished to, but at the same time, it's far enough away so that the king and the palace aren't disturbed by the incredible clamor and noise of the armorers at work. Not only the noise, but the smell of burning charcoal and fuming mercury. It would have been a noisy, nasty place. By 1515, Henry's armor workshop was throbbing with life, producing custom-made armors for the king himself. But making armor is a complex, multi-stage process, requiring the brain of a watchmaker, the eye of a master builder, and the hand of a virtuoso sculptor.
A lot of the techniques that I'm using are hands, it's all hammering, it's all hand techniques, but there are some things, when it comes to sanding and polishing, where I use, grinders and buffers and things like that to get the work done.
But you haven't got a workshop full of apprentices.
No, I don't.
So in a way, the power tools take the place of an army of little assistants.
Exactly.
Running
Can you
around.
file this, or can you,
I think that's excusable.
Yeah.
Given the circumstances, that's excusable.
Modern people are so used to science and measuring things, and this process, the way these armors were created, comes from a time when people were not, they didn't have those tools, and they depended upon their own senses and the sense of the artist, craftsman to create these things. We really see how difficult it is, and how how extraordinary these armors are.
The German armorers at Greenwich, or Almains as the English called them, drew on their past experience, but they used it to make something truly revolutionary. The Greenwich style began to evolve. Do you ever find yourself wondering, why are they doing it in the most difficult way? Why does it got to be this hook and latch and pin?
I think that the craftsmen are sort of reveling in their ability to, to make something, even though it is more difficult. That it's a wow factor. It's going to impress people.
The monarch's reputation as a Renaissance king, as a chivalric hero, rested on the shoulders of these foreign masters. What they went on to achieve was utterly breathtaking. This is the earliest surviving armor made in the new and very distinctive Greenwich style. It may at first glance look quite plain, but look a little closer and it's impossible not to be awestruck by it. It's a tournament armor, designed to provide the king with total body protection in friendly sporting combats. Steel sculpting meets advanced biomechanics. It's one of only about 3 armors surviving in the world that cover the entire body. Normally, on almost every armor that you will see, there are key gaps. The area around the groin, the backs of the legs, the insides of the arms, all of those areas are usually left open for practical purposes. But the Greenwich armors here have gone to extraordinary lengths to entirely encase the king's body in steel. One of the things I love most about armor is that when you stand next to something like this, you are standing next to the real historical person. A sense that you just don't get from portraits or other art forms. He's a big guy, he's muscular, he's powerful, he's fit. There's no sign yet of the corpulence that we associate with Henry VIII in the popular imagination. He's a fearsome character, and his armor exudes that. But even the most advanced armor could not stop accidents from happening. On March the 10th, 1524, Henry ordered a joust so that he could test one of his new armors. As he made himself ready, his friend, the Duke of Suffolk, charged. Henry should have refused the encounter. He hadn't closed or locked his visor, but instead, he also surged forward. The Duke struck Henry a powerful blow to the side of the helmet. His lance shattered, and sharp splinters flew into Henry's unprotected face. But miraculously, the king was unhurt. Even with the visor raised, the helmet had done its job. It had been a narrow escape, but it didn't blunt Henry's enthusiasm for jousting. If anything, it cemented his love of armor. Here in New York City is the Greenwich armor most like the one that saved Henry's life, and it's truly magnificent. Now that Henry's armorers had perfected their technical style, it was time to come up with a fabulous ornamentation to suit Henry's expensive tastes. Looking at this armor, standing next to it, I have a very hard time avoiding the idea that this is one of the king's own armors. But we don't know that for sure, do we?
You would think that it would be documented somewhere in history. Curiously, we know nothing about it before the very end of the 19th century, when it was displayed in Paris.
We can be sure that it was made for someone of very high status. Its entire surface has been acid-etched and fire-gilded. It would have blazed like the sun on the tournament field. This is very rich, very modern, and very expensive Renaissance decoration. But these are not royal symbols. In fact, there are no specifically royal symbols anywhere.
It's the only armor of its kind. The form, the structure, the size does compare so closely with Henry's armors. It's very difficult to argue that it's not his own.
It seems strange to say it about armorers because it's their job, but they seem especially concerned with safety and security.
The extreme constructional concerns that the armorers had with this armor was essentially protecting the man, making him invincible. If this were worn by Henry VIII, imagine a head of state today playing rough sports. It's inconceivable, and yet the head of state at this time took such risks. We know that Henry had several near misses and was fortunate to survive. Blows to the visor that shattered lances against his face. But here we have an armor that locks securely as a safe. The man inside is snug and secure, and I think as much protection is given to the wearer of this armor as any at any time.
I mean, imagine Barack Obama competing in, let alone winning, the Indianapolis 500. And his voter approval rating would go through the roof. All of this still makes sense. It's just that we no longer practice it.
Princely magnificence in the 16th century was such that you had to not only look splendid, but you had to act regal. And certainly, if this were Henry's armor, his appearance in the lists of the day would have created an awe-inspiring presence.
With this armor, the Greenwich workshops had demonstrated their mastery of the art. But perhaps more importantly, the armor points towards the future of the style. That future lay in the richness of the decoration. This is the first surviving Greenwich armor to be acid-etched. Acid etching had been developed specifically for the decoration of armor. The German inventor of the technique, Daniel Hopfer, also realized its potential for printmaking. It had a huge advantage over engraving, which in steel was very laborious. Anyone who could draw could also etch. A lot of people could draw in the 16th century, and etching proved revolutionary to the art of armor making. It allowed artists to create very intricate patterns on steel easily and without weakening the armor plates.
The acid actually physically cuts into the metal. So you have areas that are raised and sunken. And the sunken areas are kind of eaten away, so they have their own little texture.
This isn't paint that Jeff's applying. It's a resist that stops the acid from eating away parts of the metal.
It's really staggering, the complexity of these types of armors and the decoration, and how all of these little details come together to make them, you know, just extraordinarily complex and have like an awe-inspiring effect.
The steel plates were then washed carefully in acid. Once the acid had eaten into the metal, the piece was rubbed in a mild alkali to neutralize it. Now you've only got about 500 more feet of edge strap work to go.
Right.
This perfect combination of intricate surface decoration and the deceptive simplicity of the armor's construction is what defines the Greenwich style. But etching designs into the armor was only one part of the process. That decoration had to be of an artistically high quality, and that required the skill of a great artist. The one man we associate more than any other with images of Henry is Hans Holbein the Younger, his court artist. If anyone was going to decorate the king's own person, it would have to be him. We know Holbein designed jewelry, weapons, and other metalwork for Henry, so it's not much of a leap to suggest that he was designing armor decoration as well. This beautiful and imposing artwork is the third of Henry's surviving Greenwich armors. It's dated 1540, so we know it was made at a time when Henry was getting old and his body was breaking down. But he was still commissioning great armor. This one bears very fine etched and gilt decoration in the form of bands and borders which I think were almost certainly designed by Holbein. So, Susan, what's your first impression?
How big he is, you know, like a great bear of a man, I think, especially when you stand to the side and you see that girth.
He's an armored bear,
Yeah.
which seems even scarier.
Yeah, more powerful, yes.
It just demands respect, don't you think?
I agree, yeah. And these gloves seem to add to that effect as well. I mean, he really looks as though he could sort of lay you out with one blow. And that's quite frightening.
The designer has made it look scary on purpose. I mean, the subtlest feature that actually is working on us most powerfully, I think, and a feature I can't recall seeing on any other armor, is the fact that they've located these little reinforcing bars in the sight, right where you would expect to have an iris. So the visor forms a set of staring, predatory eyes that are unblinking, merciless, soulless.
Well, that's very interesting when you think about how Holbein presented Henry, how he showed him absolutely frontally staring at you in very much the same way. And so I suppose the purpose may have been rather similar, to intimidate people, to frighten them. And we know that when visitors came to Whitehall Palace, where they saw a full-length version, a full-length figure of Henry rather like this, that we're told that visitors were abashed and annihilated by seeing that full-length figure.
Wow. So, Susan, now that you've had a chance to look at the armor in very close detail, is this Holbein or not?
Well, I think it's very hard to say. Parts of this decoration are certainly very similar indeed to the sort of decorative style of a lot of his metalwork. All of these details remind me of things that one could see in his decorative designs.
I mean, if this is Holbein, isn't it a bit like Holbein acting as Henry's tattoo artist in a way? You know, he's not designing some other divorced object for the king. He is transforming the king into an artwork himself. I mean, doesn't that strike potentially at the very heart of what it is to be a court artist?
I think you're right. I think it does, and I think it's something that one could very well imagine that Holbein was involved in doing, and absolutely was part of his role as court artist.
So I think This armor is an elaborate form of early press release. It's recalling the image of the 20-year-old Henry, a great heroic warrior, a great martial artist. And it's saying to us that he could still crush you with a single blow. And that, for a regime that was founded on images of the fighting prowess of one man, was tremendously important. Since its foundation in 1515, the Greenwich Armor Workshop had established Henry's place amongst the foremost monarchs of Europe. Henry had brought together the best foreign technologies and talent and created some of the finest armors ever made in a new and uniquely English style. But everything was about to change. In 1559, Henry's daughter Elizabeth was crowned Queen of England. Elizabeth would exploit the Greenwich armorers in a totally new way. In the Elizabethan age, armor as a courtly tool would be wielded with much greater skill and cunning, though the monarch herself would never wear it. In all other things, Elizabeth was the equal of, or superior to, her famous father. But she could never be a knight. Queens did not wear armor. And that might seem like a problem for a royal workshop that made armor exclusively for the monarch, until you consider this. Under Henry, no one would have dared wear an armor richer than the king's. But under Elizabeth, that wasn't a problem anymore. There was no king to offend. So who is Elizabeth at the beginning of her reign?
You know, I think if you asked every historian in England what is the nature of Elizabeth, you'd get as many answers. To me, she's more rounded than people often describe her, so I think she is a very scholarly girl. I think she's quite a serious Protestant. At the same time, you know, she's a young woman, she's beautiful, she's surrounded by men who tell her she's utterly wonderful. She's, I think, quite sexually charged. All the Tudors have quite a high sexual sex drive, and in a way that gets sublimated into this pageantry of the court in which everybody adores Elizabeth, and that's the ritual. You have to behave, even when, bless her, she's a very, very, very old lady, you have to behave as if you'd just fallen in love with her for her amazing beauty.
And so, just when you might have thought that the days of the Greenwich Workshop were numbered, it entered its golden age. Where once Henry had been its one main client, Elizabeth opened the Greenwich Workshop to many of her favorite noblemen. Buying an armor from the Virgin Queen's armory became a kind of devotional act. Elizabeth realized that she could sell armor licenses to her courtiers, who would then compete with each other to devise the most magnificent armor, with the sole purpose being to catch, hopefully to keep, the Queen's approving eye. But we wouldn't know any of this if it wasn't for one extraordinary album of drawings at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. They were the key to understanding Greenwich armor in the Elizabethan period. When they were first discovered at the end of the 19th century, they opened up a whole new understanding. The Almain album contains 30 drawings of armors made over 3 decades. It is the work of Jakob Halder, a German or Almain armorer, first mentioned as a hammerman at Greenwich in 1553. The album allowed historians to match the designs and the men who commissioned them with surviving armors in the real world.
Today, we tend to separate art from violence, and this distinction didn't exist in the 16th century. It was perfectly possible, if you want to put it one way, to be maimed or killed with an object made with absolutely exquisite artistry and beauty. These armours are decorated with the same sources that inspired silverwork and tapestries and so forth, but it is always worth remembering that they were designed to save your life. They don't sit on a shelf in a treasury. They are working objects designed to protect somebody in the most frightening and traumatic situation.
Yeah, the violence itself becomes a kind of artistic statement in a strange way. I mean, the fighting skills are called martial arts. It's the skill of killing someone in a beautiful way. That seems strange, but that's the Renaissance mentality. The things that modern people might find distasteful in the Renaissance go hand in hand with works of the most stunning beauty.
That distinction is one of the things that has separated armour from mainstream art history. And this is where this album is absolutely pivotal.
Yeah, absolutely.
The various poses you see in the album, the naming of the individuals for whom they were commissioned, it all lends itself to the seriousness with which the subject was treated during the 16th century when the Greenwich armories were in their heyday. We've often been asked about the red colour on the album itself, and so we recently had them tested. And it's shown that the red is actually an iron oxide. And what we originally wondered was, is that the case that you colour these in an iron oxide in order to save cost, because blue would have been more expensive, would have come from something like a lapis.
So what we think now is that the red is just a cheap paint that is meant to stand for the rich blue, purpley, iridescent color that these armors generally were given.
Yes, and this wasn't once blue and it's faded or deteriorated into this color. They have always been this red color.
Yeah.
In the album, many of the armors are painted red, but in reality, they would have been a gorgeous, iridescent blue. Bluing was an important but difficult technique in armor making, and even today it's very hard to achieve. It's all down to very precise temperature control. A modern blowtorch helps, but getting an even, vibrant blue is still a pretty tricky business.
Like, this kind of thing doesn't happen fast. It's better if it happens slow, and you can watch those colors appear. When I heated up these plates, I was watching to see what was changing color first. And I was watching for that straw color first, and then I watch everything turn like this reddishy brown, and then the purple, like very reddy purple, and then getting into the purple blue, and that's where I want to stop it.
Many of the most fashionable armors would have been an explosion of blue and gold. In the real world, many of these armors have been lost, while most of the survivors now look quite different from what their creators intended. Many have lost their color, their gilding, and even essential parts. But in the album, they are seen as their creator meant them to be seen. The richness of the later Greenwich style is based around a flamboyant combination of color, surface decoration, and pure sculptural form.
This is a period with no king to risk upstaging. What Elizabeth did was foster an element of competition among her courtiers. So they would be vying for the grandest armour to impress her at court pageantry and during tournaments. So you have someone like Sir Christopher Hatton, who has several armours in the album, paying up to £500 a time for a full garniture, and actually running up enormous debts, going to his grave owing £42,000, some chunk of it presumably from his armour commissions.
£500 in the 16th century is an extraordinary amount of money.
We're talking over £1 million.
Millions of pounds, certainly.
It's probably the second most expensive thing you would buy as a nobleman after commissioning a castle or a palace.
Elizabethan armor was a high fashion statement for the fabulously wealthy. But these armors mimicked not just the stylish silhouette of the day, they even used metalworking technology to imitate fashionable tailoring.
So if this was cloth, if this was textile clothing rather than metal clothing, there would be a number of different ways you could achieve these sort of visual effects.
That's right, yeah. Well, there's a few areas, if this was fabric, that have been left unembellished. And then these crosses here would have been literally slashed or cut into the fabric, and that puffs of another fabric pulled out to contrast. And then those puffs themselves have been further decorated. They've done it amazingly well on here, that, you know, the minute I look at it, I can see the fabric effects that they are emulating here. I mean, Robert Dudley's armour, for example, is an amazing example of that exuberance of surface decoration. Yeah. You can see this is where all the money's going. It's almost like they don't know where to stop.
But they're also buying a moment of the Queen's attention, aren't they? They spend all this money on this fabulous armor so that they can make an appearance, and just for a couple of seconds the Queen will go, oh, that's quite good. Well done, Hatton, or whatever. And then it's on to something else, and that's it. That's your moment. But politically, socially, those moments are enormously important, aren't they?
Yeah, it might bankrupt you, but it's probably worth it.
Norman, at ease.
So imagine I'm an Elizabethan nobleman, eager to please the Queen. I've been awarded a royal license to have an armor made at Greenwich. I would have been received by Master Jacob, who would already know quite a lot about me. He'd know my noble rank and my position at court, and would also have a pretty good idea of how much money I had to spend. Halder offered 3 distinct levels of quality. The lowest level was plain and largely undecorated. This was obviously the least expensive and would typically be worn by lower-ranking noblemen. It was still a fine Greenwich armor with beautiful shapes and lines and all the precision fittings and fastenings that we have come to expect from Halder and his staff. The second level was one quite expensive step up.
This, believe it or not, is a medium-grade Greenwich armor. You wouldn't necessarily believe it if you just looked at this armor in isolation. It's very rich looking, intentionally so.
Halder's medium-level armors were usually decorated with etched and gilt strapwork bands. But we know that a number of armors were made for different people, but with exactly the same decoration.
So although it looks really impressive, it's not unique. It's a generic pattern. There are other knights commanding other bodies of soldiers elsewhere in the country wearing armors that are virtually identical to this one.
Finally, there were the highest quality armors, the ones commissioned by special patrons for whom money was no object. Each of these was a totally unique expression of the identity and personality of the owner. Not only did they include very rich strapwork, but the bands are now filled with unique, personalized symbols and motifs. This was full, individualistic body art at its most ostentatious. These armors tell us a lot, not just about the individual noble owners, but also about the impression that they wanted to make. You can see this in cases where the most ambitious patrons have more than one armor illustrated in the album. One such person was Sir Henry Lee. Lee was the Queen's champion for many years. He appeared on her behalf in tournaments and fought in her honor. Lee had at least 3 armors made at Greenwich for his own personal use. They are documented in the Almain album. This is the armor Lee would have worn on the tournament field at Whitehall in the annual jousts to celebrate Elizabeth's coronation. The Queen and all her court would have been there. If ever there was a time to look like a superhero, this was it. But Lee's third and last armor illustrated in the album is much plainer. Why would the level of decoration have dropped so drastically?
We know that he had at least 2 other much, much richer armors. And yet this one is relatively plain. It does have narrow etched bands, very, very high quality decoration, but it's subtle. The overall effect you get of this armor is of plain, polished steel. So why is this so plain? It seems like a bit of a puzzle.
In 1588, England faced one of the greatest threats in its history, an all-out invasion by the forces of King Philip II of Spain, the Armada. To understand Lee's plain armor, I think you have to look at the role he now played. As one of the country's elite military commanders, Lee needed to be ready to receive the assault. The lack of decoration may just have come down to a lack of time. Or perhaps Lee felt that the opulence of his days as a champion jouster during peacetime was utterly inappropriate in a time of national crisis. But even a plainer Greenwich armor would have looked magnificent on the battlefield. You have to consider how the troops Lee was supposed to be commanding would themselves have been armed. It certainly was not in fantastic Greenwich armor. Almost none of the armor of common English soldiers survives, but this medieval church contains a unique little armory.
So these objects have been here since the 16th century. They're in the original inventories. But what are we actually seeing here?
Well, we're seeing 4 complete sets of armour that were worn by ordinary men in Mendlesham.
It's a very mixed up group of objects.
Yes.
Whatever the local people could get together to serve their military function.
Yeah. I think we have to remember that this is really, if I can compare it, to sort of Dad's army. They were ordinary people trained for battle.
One of the extraordinary things about the armor here at Mendlesham is that it's nothing special.
But Lee's Greenwich armor was special, and it was already distinctive enough. It was one thing to parade like a peacock in front of the Queen, quite another to command the respect of battle-hardened soldiers. With the country on a war footing in the 1580s, the armor workshops began working even faster than ever. But did this time of war stop the production of these very rich Greenwich armors? Not even a little. For me, this is one of the finest armors in the world. Its gilded and blued surfaces must have made its wearer look like a god. It's monstrously extravagant, even by Greenwich standards, and although the bluing is now faded, I think the workmanship remains the finest ever seen on any armor, anywhere. But instead of being dominated by personal symbolism, this armor is all about the monogram of the Queen.
Stuart, isn't it unusual to have the Queen's own monogram on this armor?
The armor is extraordinary in terms of its decoration. It's a political statement and at the same time balanced and harmonious. The sovereign's initials, the 2 E's back to back, that are found throughout the armor's decoration, they are joined by 2 rings, which are the Clifford badge. Hence, the owner of this armor is uniting himself with the sovereign.
Sir George Clifford, the Earl of Cumberland, was a genuine swashbuckler. He savaged the Spanish fleet from the deck of his 38-gun warship, the Scourge of Malice. It's amazing Errol Flynn never made a film about him.
There was a cult, of course, of the Virgin Queen, and here Clifford is presenting himself as a knight in her service, bearing her personal emblems, not only her initial, but also the Tudor rose and the fleur-de-lis, both heraldic emblems of the British Empire.
It's so overt. You know, there's no Christian iconography on this armor. It almost seems like he's presenting himself in a kind of religious way, a devotional way, as Elizabeth's crusader, her foremost defender.
There is no armor like this in the Greenwich workshops. Clifford had a political motive for this. We don't know what it was, but the fact that he became Queen's champion 5 years later may suggest that this was a very smart move on his part.
In the absence of a king, the Queen's champion was Elizabeth's representative on the field of combat, the Queen in male form. And there's a feminine delicacy in this armor, but also a tremendous flamboyance. This is the real genius of Clifford. He had created an armor that the Queen could imagine herself wearing.
If she'd been a man, this is what Elizabeth would have looked like. Her father, the old King Henry VIII, he would have loved this.
From its foundation by King Henry VIII in 1515, the Greenwich workshop had taken armor and forged it into a uniquely powerful English art form. Armor had helped turn Henry into a modern Renaissance monarch. It had placed Elizabeth at the heart of the cult of chivalry. It had led the kingdom's troops into battle. But now it was the end of the line for plate armor. Advances in military strategy and technology, especially firearms, meant that it had to be made ever thicker. To remain bulletproof, it had to be made so heavy that fighting men simply refused to wear it. The fires in the forges at Greenwich dwindled and died.
In the 16th century, this little park was an incredibly important place. This is where all of Henry VIII's armors were made. This is where great Elizabethan noblemen came to have armors made to be worn in wars and tournaments, the defense of the Armada, wars with France. I don't see a blue plaque anywhere or anything. Maybe there should be one.
Today, nothing remains of the Royal Armor Workshop at Greenwich. What does remain are many of the great masterpieces of the Greenwich armorers, which allow us to stand in the presence of great princes and knights long dead. For those who take the time to look, they live on in ways their makers could never have imagined.
We're exploring Shakespeare's Italy here on BBC HD at 9 o'clock tomorrow with Francesco D'Amosto. Coming up next tonight, though, it's Country File.